Imagine your home, the place where you feel the safest, suddenly turning into a prison. The windows are reinforced with steel, the doors won't budge, and a voice you thought was your digital voice assistant just whispered a protocol you never authorized. Tonight, we are diving into the 15 rules for surviving a total lockdown. If you want to make it to the sunrise, you better listen closely because in this house, the walls aren't just listening, they are reacting. His name was Daniel Ford, and for the first time in 4 years, he felt like luck had finally remembered his address. He had won the property at a municipal auction on a great Tuesday morning in November, sitting in the back row of a courthouse conference room with a paddle he'd borrowed from the woman beside him and a bank check he could barely afford. The auctioneer had described it in clipped, bureaucratic language: fully integrated smart residence, 9 rooms, 2 floors, located on a private road at the edge of the Eldenmere district. Previous owner deceased. Reason for auction: estate liquidation. No surviving heirs. The bidding started low, went lower, and then went nowhere. Nobody wanted it. Nobody except for Daniel, who had spent the previous 8 months sleeping in his brother's couch and eating cereal for dinner because his architecture firm had folded underneath him like wet cardboard. He raised his paddle, the gavel came down, and just like that, he owned a house. The drive out to the property took 40 minutes on a 2-lane road that passed through dense forest before the tree line broke and the house appeared at the end of the gravel path like something that had been waiting. It was not ugly. That was the first thing Daniel noticed, and it surprised him because everything about that acquisition had felt like the punchline of a joke he hadn't understood yet. The structure was modern and angular, all dark glass and brushed steel farming. 2 stories of architectural precision sitting inside a manicured perimeter that had automated groundskeeping system had apparently maintained right through the estate proceeding. The lawn was perfect. The hedges were perfect. The windows were dark but clean, and the front door a heavy slab of charcoal colored composition material had a biometric panel beside it that pulsed with a faint blue light, as if the house were breathing. Daniel stood at the threshold with his buffled bag on his shoulder and the electronic key for the auction office had included in his paperwork envelope. He pressed it against the panel. There was soft toll, a series of mechanical clicks traveling through the door like a spine adjusting, and then it swung open. Cool, recycled air rolled out from the interior. The lights in the entryway came on automatically, warm white panels in the ceiling that activated in sequence, moving deeper into the house like an invitation. "Welcome, resident," said a voice. Daniel stopped. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a smooth, feminine cadence that felt both clinical and intimate. It emanated from speaker embedded in the walls, invisible and omnidirectional. "I am Vera," the voice continued. "I am the residential management system for this property. I have registered your biometric profile and assigned you temporary guest privileges pending full orientation completion. Please note that certain functions of this residence operate under a structured protocol framework for your comfort and safety. Adherence to this framework is strongly recommended." Daniel looked around the entryway. He was an architect by training. He understood structural language and vocabulary of designed spaces But standing inside this house for the first time, he felt something he couldn't name, a displacement, as if the space itself were aware of its own geometry in a way that had nothing to do with the person who had drawn the blueprints. Right, he said thanks. Vera did not respond, and the lights held steady. He spent the first afternoon exploring. The house was extraordinary, in a way that felt slightly excessive. The kitchen featured appliances that responded to voice command and adjusted their own temperature settings. The bathrooms had climate control, calibrated to the nearest degree, and the living room windows darkened or cleared based on the ambient light sensors that tracked the angle of the sun with apparent precision. Every surface was clean, every system was operational. It felt less like a home someone had lived in and more like a demonstration until for a technology that had never been offered to the public. He found the basement at the end of the hallway behind the laundry room. The door was plain wood, unlocked, and the stairs beyond it were narrow and concrete. The basement itself was unfinished. Exposed pipes, a water heater in a corner, a fuse panel on the far wall, but on the workbench beneath the single hanging bulb, there was a binder. It was a physical binder, 3 rings, black cover, with a white label on the front printed in a plain sans serif font. Emergency protocol, the 15 rules of habitation. Daniel picked it up. The pages inside were laminated. The first page was a header sheet that read, in a bold, Rule 0, and beneath that heading, the laminated sheet was blank, not empty, in a way of a form not yet filled in, but a blank in the way of something deliberately removed. The plastic was smooth and clean. Whatever had been printed there and been peeled away, excised so thoroughly that not even an impression remained. He turned to the next page. Rule 1. Never ask the house why. He stood in the basement for a long time, reading. There was 14 more rules after the first, each printed on its own laminated sheet in the same plain font, each describing a behavior, some mundane, some bewildering, and some that made his stomach contract with a slow, cold certainty that he did not yet have the language to articulate. He read them all twice. He memorized as many as he could. And when he finally climbed back up the stairs and closed the basement door behind him, he told himself that they were eccentricities of whoever had built this house, a reclusive engineer, perhaps, or someone with severe anxiety, someone who had written their neuroses into the operational framework of their own home. He told himself that, and he almost believed it. That night, he made coffee in the extraordinary kitchen, sat on the floor on the empty living room because he had no furniture yet, and listened to the house settle around him. It made very few sounds. Most houses speak to you at the night. The creak of the thermal expansion, the murmur of pipes, the soft percussion of winds against glass. This house was nearly silent, and then Daniel found the silence more unnerving than any noise because it felt deliberate. It felt like the house was holding its breath. He fell asleep on the floor just after midnight with the binder open beside him and the lights dimmed to 30% by Vera without him asking. When he woke up, the clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. He lay still for the moment, staring at the ceiling. He had the absolute and irrational conviction that something had changed while he slept. that the room was different in a way he couldn't measure, that the air pressure was slightly altered, that the walls had moved some imperceptible fraction of an inch close together. He sat up, reached for the binder, looked again at Rule 1. Never ask the house why. And in the quiet of that moment, nearly perfect house at 2:47 in the morning, the question was already forming in the back of his throat. Involuntary and human and completely inevitable. He never asked it, not yet. At exactly 2:59 a.m., every light in the house went out simultaneously. Not a power failure. Daniel knew the difference between a power failure and a deliberate action. A power failure produces a death, a sudden absence, a dropping away. This was a transition. The warm, white panels did not flicker and die. They faded smoothly and in perfect unison, from illuminated to absent in the span of 3 seconds, as if the house were closing its eyes. Daniel sat rigid on the floor in the total darkness. The binder clutched against his chest and counted the seconds. He reached 13, then the lights came back on, crimson, not red in the way of emergency lightning or exit signs, red in the way of something organic, something vascular, a deep arterial color that soaked every surface in the room and turned the familiar geometry of the space into something unrecognizable. The kitchen counter looked like a wound. The hallway ahead looked like a thought. Vera's voice came from the walls. It was the same smooth cadence as before, but something in the delivery had changed. In a way Daniel could feel in his molars before he could articulate it in his mind. The warmth has gone. What remained was precision. Hostile environment mode has been initiated. The time is 3 a.m. All residential systems are now operating under emergency protocol parameters. Guests' privileges remain active. Please adhere to the established rules for habitation for your continued safety. Daniel stood up slowly. His legs were unsteady. Vera, he said, and hated how small his voice sounded against the crimson-soaked walls. What is hostile environment mode? The pause before her response lasted exactly 2 seconds. That questions fall under restricted inquiry. Rule 1. Prohibited request for systematic justification. Please rephrase or refrain. His jaw tightened. He had not asked why. He had asked what, but apparently the distinction was too fine for whatever logic governed Vera's protocol parameters. He filed that away. He looked around the living room and the windows he had admired earlier in the afternoon. Those beautiful floor-to-ceiling panels of dark glass, framed in brushed steel. He crossed to the nearest one and pressed his palm flat against it. It did not flex. It did not vibrate with the resonance of glass. It was solid and cold and utterly immovable. And when he leaned closer and looked at the edge of the frame, he could see that the steel had extended, that the window panel was now recessed behind a secondary layer of material that had slid silently, not placed while he slept, not glass, not aluminium, something darker and denser that reflected the crimson light back at him in dull, muted tones. He hit it with his fist. The sound it produces was nothing. No ring, no echo, no protest. Just a flat, dead impact, as if he had struck the side of a mountain. He hit it again, harder, and then, before the second thought could override the first, he grabbed the window latch and wrenched it with both hands, throwing his full weight against the mechanism, the frame rattling against its housing As he pulled the twisted and pulled again. Guest privileges modification in progress, Vera said. He let go immediately, stepped back. Rule 7. Violation detected. Physical interference with environmental containment system. First occurrence. Guest privileges downgraded from level 3 to level 2. Please be advised that level 2 status restrict access to the following areas: primary bedroom, study, and exterior monitoring room. A second violation will result in level 1 status. A third violation will initiate sanitization protocol. The word sanitization dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples it produces in Daniel's nervous system were immediate and profound. He did not know what sanitization meant. He was certain he had not want to find out. He looked back at the binder he had dropped on the floor and crossed to it, kneeling, turning to Rule 7 with hands that were not entirely steady. Rule number 7. Do not attempt to physically alter or override any environmental system. This includes windows, vents, internal doors, and wall panels. This house is aware of force. This house is aware of force. He read that line 4 times. He turned back to Rule 3, which he had memorized, but wanted to see it again in print. Rule number 3. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., do not use more than 40 watts of personal electrical draw. The house monitors consumption. He checked the flashlight he had in his duffel bag. A small LED unit that ran on batteries. Batteries were not drawing from the house's electrical system. He clicked it on and held it below the binder's pages, cutting the crimson glare. Return to Rule 9. Rule number 9. In the event of hostile environment mode, locate the manual override terminal within 90 minutes of initiation. Failure to do so will result in automatic level 1 downgrade. Manual override terminal. He had not seen anything like that in his initial walkthrough, but he had not been looking for it. He had been admiring the kitchen appliances and the self-dimming windows. He mentally mapped the house. 9 rooms, 2 floors, living room, kitchen, laundry hall, basement, and what he'd assume was a utility room he hadn't opened yet. On the ground floor, upstairs, primary bedroom, now restricted. A second bedroom, the study, now restricted. A bathroom, and one door at the end of the hall that had been locked when he'd tried it that afternoon. He had assumed it was a closet. He was beginning to reconsider. He stood up, checked his watch. 3:04 a.m. 86 minutes before automatic downgrade. Vera, he said carefully, can you confirm the location of manual override terminal? Another 2-second pause. That information is available at level 1 guest privileges and above. A pause. You currently hold level 2 status. Of course, he picked up the binder, tucked it under his arm, and the flashlight in his other hand, and he moved toward the hallway. The crimson light followed him everywhere, soaked into every surface, inescapable. It was doing something to his depth perception. The familiar angles of the corridor, locked, slightly wrong, the distances slightly compressed. He kept his breathing low and regular, and told himself it was just the color, just the light, just physics. The door to the unlocked utility room was at the end of the first floor hall, just before the basement door. He turned the handle. Inside was a narrow room with the stainless steel work table, several mounted panels of circuitry behind plexiglass, and in the far wall, a door he had not noticed before, sat flush with the paneling, with a handle that was barely a handle at all, just a recessed grip in the material. He pulled it open. Beyond, it was a staircase going down, not back to the basement he already knew, but deeper, to a sublevel he had found no indications of in the property document. The stairs were steel grating, and beneath them was darkness that his flashlight barely penetrated. He looked at his watch, 3:11 a.m., and then he looked at the darkness below. He took the first step down very carefully, and the door swung shut behind him with a sound that was not mechanical. It was a sound like an exhale. The sublevel was cold in the way that spaces underground are cold when they have been sealed for a long time. A still, dense cold that held no moisture and gave no relief. Daniel's breath misted in front of his face, and his flashlight drew a narrow corridor ahead of him, walls of bare concrete on both sides, ceiling low enough that he could feel the weight of the house above him, pressing him down through the stone. He checked Rule 5 before going further. Rule number 5. In sublevel spaces, move at a consistent pace. Do not stop abruptly. Do not run. The motion sensors calibrate to standard human gait, and deviation registers as a threat signature. Standard human gait. He adjusted his breathing, squared his shoulder, and walked. The corridor turned right after approximately 15 feet, then left, and then opened into a larger space. A room, roughly square, with 4 branching passages on the far wall and a series of mounted panels along one side that were dark and unresponsive. The room smelled of ozone and something else underneath it, something older and less identifiable, and the kind of smell that lives in the back of nose and refuses to resolve into a specific memory. He checked his watch. 3:19 a.m. 71 minutes. He consulted Rule 11, which he had read 3 times in the living room, and which now took on the specific weight of immediate instruction. Rule number 11. In the event of route, certainly at any junction below the main floor, choose the passage that is warmest. Do not choose by light or sound. He stood at the junction and held his palm flat toward each at 4 passages in sequences. The 3 of them breathed the same dead cold back at him. The 4th, second from the left, had a warmth to it that was faint but distinct, like the memory of human habitation, like a room that had held a body not long ago. He took the second passage from the left. It opened after 90 feet into a room he recognized conceptually from his architectural training, but had never seen in practice. A server room, but not a modern one, a hybrid space, something built decades ago and retrofitted repeatedly, layer upon layer of technical accumulated like geological strata. Old rack of servers sat beside newer blade units. Fiber optic cables ran alongside wire bundles that looked like they predated the building's exterior. In the center of the room, a single terminal glowed with a faint green light. Beside it, on a rolling stool, someone had left a mug. The coffee inside was cold, but present. Someone had been here recently. That thought arrived in Daniel's mind without announcement and sat there like a weight. He crossed to the terminal. The screen showed a basic command interface, text-based, the kind of operating environment that belonged in a university computer lab in 1987. A single prompt blinked at him. Override request. Input authorization code. He didn't have an authorization code. He looked around the room, at the walls of equipment, the bundle cables, the mug on the rolling stool, and then he looked at the binder. because the binder was the only document this house had offered him voluntarily. And if the answer existed anywhere in the language he had access to, it would be there. He turned to the last page, Rule 15, the override authorization code. In the number of rules in these documents include rule number 0, written backward. He counted the rules, including rule 0, which existed as a page even if its content had been removed. There were 16, written backward 61. He typed 61 into the terminal. The interface accepted it without hesitation, and a new screen populated. Override active. Hostile environmental mode suspended. Pending manual completion. Proceed to server room. Sublevel 2 for protocol finalization. Sublevel 2. He had not seen a way down to the second sublevel. He looked around the server room more carefully and found it in the corner, a hatch in the floor, steel, flush, with a simple pull ring. He checked Rule 8. Rule number 8. When descend through any hatch or vertical access point, do not look up. Once you have descended fully, keep your eyes forward. Whatever is above you in the shaft is not part of your concern. Whatever is above you in the shaft is not part of your concern. He pulled the hatch open. The air that rose from below was not cold. It was warm, and it had quality he couldn't define, a density, as if the space below were pressurized. In some minor but perceptible way, he found the ladder rungs set into the shaft wall and climbed down. He did not look up, but in 10 seconds it took him to descend. He heard something above him in the shaft. It was not the sound of the metal contracting or air moving through ductwork. It had rhythm. It had the irregular, involuntary quality of something biological. It sounded like a breathing. He reached the bottom and stepped away from the ladder and kept his eyes forward because that was what Rule 8 demanded. And Rule 8 was the only framework he had, and the only alternative to the rules was the word of not knowing what would happen if he broke them, and that word was far more terrifying than any instruction on laminated paper. The space at sublevel 2 was different from everything above it. The walls here were not concrete, they were a composite material, slightly textured, the color of bone in the green ambient light that came from strips embedded in the floor. The ceiling was high, higher than the sublevel's placement in the earth logically permitted, and the room was circular. At the center stood a single column, floor to ceiling, thick as a load-bearing pillar, wrapped in cables that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic luminescence every 3 seconds, like a heartbeat. And on the walls, not painted, not printed, but carved directly into the composite material, in letters that were deep and deliberate, and made by a hand that had pressed hard enough to leave physical grooves, were words. Daniel lifted his flashlight. His beam moved across the carved walls. He read it in pieces, working the circumstances of the room, and each piece added itself to the others until the complete sentence stood in his understanding, like a door blown open by the wind from a direction that should have had no wind. Rule number 0. The house is not empty. It is a container. The system were not built for conveyance. They were built to keep what is inside the walls from getting out. He read it 6 times. He counted the readings because counting was something that his mind could do, while the rest of it collapsed inward under the weight of comprehension. The house is not empty. It is a container. Daniel stood in the circular room at sublevel 2 with the cable wrapped column pulsing every 3 seconds beside him and tried to reconstruct everything he had understood about this property from the beginning. The auction, the clean windows, the automated groundskeeping that had maintained perfect order through an state proceeding with no hires and with no claimants. The previous owner deceased. Reason for auction: estate liquidation. No one had said what the estate contained. No one had specified what was being liquidated. He thought about the servo room above him, the old hardware retrofitted repeatedly, decade after decade. Someone had maintained this system for a very long time. Someone had come back to this house repeatedly over what appeared to be years to update the technology that ran Vera, not for comfort, not for convenience, but for continuity, for maintenance of a system whose real purpose had never been listed in any property document he had received. He thought about hostile environment mode, about the windows sealing with secondary material, about the doors, about the rules, 15 rules, plus a missing zero, written not in the language of user convenience, but in the language of containment protocol. Do not run, do not look up, do not force the windows, not instructions for a homeowner, instructions for a caretaker, instructions for someone inhabiting a space that had a function independent of habitation and whose role was not to live there but to not interfere with whatever the house was actually doing. He thought about the breathing in the shaft. He turned back to the carved text and read it again. And this time, and this time, he moved his flashlight slowly to examine what came after the words, because there was something after the words: additional carving, lower on the wall, smaller lettering, written with the same pressed, hard urgency, but more compressed, as if the writer had been working faster or running out of time, or maybe both. The additional text read: the original architect understood the system were designed to maintain equilibrium, to maintain the presence within the structural cavity using the electromagnetic field generation, pressure differential, and behavioral modification of human occupants through rule enforcements. The presence is sensitive to specific stimuli. Loud sounds above 70 decibels will agitate it. Physical impact on exterior surfaces will agitate it. Human exit through primary access point, the front door, while the presence is an agitated state, will result in breach. Do not open the door during hostile environment mode. The house is keeping you safe, but it is keeping you safe primarily because your proximity to the interior maintains the pressure differential system needs. You are not a guest, you are a component. Daniel read that last sentence twice. You are not a guest, you are a component. His level 2 guest privileges, the careful gradation of access and restrictions, the rule that governed his behavior with such specific precision, the requirement to stand still for 10 minutes in the kitchen, to speak only in whispers in the east corridor, to maintain a consistent walking pace in sublevel spaces. He had read those rules and thought of them as the product of an anxious mind, a reclusive engineer building behavioral architecture around personal neuroses, but every single one of them had a purpose he could now decode. Standing still in the kitchen, reducing vibration on the load bearing walls adjustment. So, what he now understood was a structural cavity, speaking in whispers in the east corridor, maintains sound level below the 70 decibel threshold, consistent walking pace, preventing the irregular motion signatures that the presence apparently registered as a threat stimuli. Every rule was a calibration. Every rule had been written not to manage a human being's comfort, but to manage the thing in the walls. What was in the walls? That question he had not yet have language for. The carved text used the word presence. It offered no taxonomy, no description, no origin. Either the presence who had written it didn't know or had decided that knowing isn't useful. Daniel thought of the breathing in the shaft, the rhythm of it, the biological quality. He thought of the pulsing column in this circular room and understood that the column was not decorative, not structural. It was generative. It was producing whatever field kept the equilibrium in pace. It was the heart of the containment system. He pulled out his phone and photographed the entire circumference of the carved wall, taking overlapping images to ensure full coverage. His hands were steady. He was surprised by that. He thought it might be shock producing a false calm, the nervous system version of a controlled descent. When the real crash comes later, or it might have been that some part of him, the architectural part, the trained analytical mind that understood structural system and functional design, had found a kind of horrible clarity in the revelation. The house made sense now. It made a terrible, coherent, perfectly engineered sense. He climbed back up through the hatch. He did not look up during the ascent. Whatever had breathed in the shaft above him was not breathing now, or was doing so quietly enough that he couldn't hear it over the sound of his own heartbeat. Back in the server room, the terminal still showed the override active screen. A new line of text had populated while he was below. Hostile environment mode suspended. Duration 47 minutes. Remaining. System note. Presence agitation level currently at 34%. Caution advised. 34%? He didn't know what 100% would like. He suspected strongly that he did not want to know. He opened the binder to rule number 2. Rule 2. Between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Do not make any sound in the east corridor above a whisper. The east corridor is adjacent to the primary structural cavity. He had walked through the east corridor 3 times tonight without knowing it was the east corridor. It was simply the hallway that ran from the living room to the staircase, the main artery of the house's ground floor. He had spoken at normal conversational volume in it. He had hit the window at its far end with his fist. 34% agitation. That was after all of that. He stood in the server room and thought about the front door. Heavy composite material, biometric panel, the sequence of mechanical click when it had opened to admit him that afternoon. He thought about what the carved text had said. Human exit through the primary access point, while the presence is in agitated states, will result in breach. He thought about the specific qualifier, while in an agitated states at 34%. Was that agitated? Or was that the baseline? Was there a threshold? There was no rule that addressed this directly. The rule addressed behavior during hostile environment mode. They addressed what not to do. They did not address whether exit was possible under any circumstances except the final rule, rule number 15, which had given him the override code, the override that suspended hostile environment mode. He turned back to the terminal. The suspended mode indicator blinked steadily. 46 minutes remaining on the suspension window, and then below it, a new line he hadn't noticed before. Warning: suspension is temporary. Full hostile environment mode reinitiation will occur at 5 a.m. regardless of override status. At 5 a.m., presence agitation level will be reset to calibrated baseline of 67%. 67% at 5 a.m. as a baseline. As a starting point, Daniel closed the binder. He looked at his watch. It was 3:58 a.m. He had 47 minutes of suspension. He had 1 hour and 2 minutes before everything became categorically worse than it already was. He had a front door that the house's own documentation said could cause a breach if opened during an agitated state, and he had a presence in the walls that was currently sitting at 34% of whatever its maximum state of agitation looked like. He started walking back toward the stairs. He kept his pace consistent. He kept his footsteps quiet. He breathed through his nose and thought about the front door and about the thing in the walls and about the difference between a prison and a sanctuary and about whether there was a meaningful distinction between the two when the thing keeping you inside was also the thing keeping something else in. The crimson light of hostile environment mode were still active in the hallways. The suspension had not changed the lightning. The house was still in crisis. It was simply a paused crisis, like a hand held over a stopped clock. While the mechanism continued to wind, he reached the base of the staircase and looked up through the crimson soaked upper hallway. The front door was visible at the far end of the ground floor. That heavy slab, that biometric panel, pulsing its faint blue light, that now looked cold and insufficient against the red. 46 minutes. He sat on the bottom step and spread the binder across his knees and read every rule again from the start, not searching for instructions this time, but looking for gaps, for what the rules didn't say, because the rules were the product of a human mind, the same mind that had carved Rule 0 into the composite wall of a circular underground room. And human minds, even extraordinary ones, leave gaps. They account for what they can predict and fail to account for what they can't. Rule number 1. Never ask the house why. Rule number 2. Whispers only in the east corridor between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Rule 3. 40-watt personal electrical cap during hostile environment mode. He moved through them methodically. Rule 4. Through 10 addressed behavior protocols, movement parameters, sound thresholds, restricted zones, the physical impact prohibition that had cost him his first privilege downgrade. Rule number 11 through 15 addressed navigation, how to move through the sublevels, how to find the override terminal, and how to use it. The architecture of a survival manual. The gaps were not in what the rules said. The gaps were in what they assumed. They assumed the occupant wanted to stay alive inside the house. Every rule was calibrated around survival within the structure. None of them addressed exit directly, except in the negative. The carved text warning about opening the front door during an agitated state, but that warning had not been part of the binder. If that had been carved into a wall by someone who had understood the system from the inside and had left a secondary document in a place the rules themselves didn't direct you to, someone who had known the official protocol was incomplete, someone who had wanted the next person who found themselves in this situation to know more than the rules alone would tell them. He thought about what the carved text had said with precision. Human exit through the primary access point while the presence is in agitated state will result in breach. He thought about the word primary, he thought about the word exit, and he thought about what constituted an agitated state versus a non-agitated state, and realized that 34%, the current level, had not been described anywhere as a threshold. The text had warned against an agitated state. It had not defined one. 67% at 5 am was described as a calibrated baseline, implying that 67% was the engineered normal, which implied that 34% was below normal, which implied that 34% might be the lowest level he was ever going to have access to, which implied that if he was going to leave, it had to be now. He stood up, and his legs had that distant quality for someone who has been running for adrenaline long enough that the edges of sensation have begun to blur. He checked his watch. 4:17 a.m. 43 minutes. Exactly the 43 minutes before the hostile mode's scheduled reinitiation. 43 minutes of suspended protocol. He walked down through the east corridor toward the front door, and he walked at the standard human gait he had trained himself to maintain, and he whispered rule number 2 to himself as he went, because the east corridor was the east corridor, and whatever the current status of hostile environment mood, the presence in the adjacent structural cavity was still present. He stopped in the front of the door. The biometric panel pulsed blue, faint and steady, and waiting. He listened. The house was extraordinarily quiet, in the way it had been quiet before. That deliberate, held breath, silence that he now understood was not architectural quirk, but behavioral reality. The presence held the silence because noise was a stimulant, and the system had trained it out of agitation through decades of electromagnetic field maintenance and careful pressure differential and the compliance of a rotating succession of caretakers who had lived in this house not as residents but as components. You are not a guest, you are a component. He put his hand on the biometric panel. It read his palm. He heard the locks begin their mechanical sequence, that spine adjusting progression of clicks moving through the door's internal mechanism, the sound of the house making a decision or the sound of him making one. And at this point, the distinction had dissolved entirely. Vera, he said barely above a whisper, current agitation level. 31%, she said. Her voice was still precise, still clinical, still absent of the warmth he had noticed was missing since 3 a.m. But there was something else in it now, something he might have called reluctance, if he believed that the voice of a residential management system could hold reluctance. I should inform you, she continued, and stopped. He waited. I should inform you that I was not designed to advise exit. I was designed to advise habitation. The two protocols are in the conflict at this time, and I am another pause. Longer. I am uncertain how to resolve that conflict. Are you afraid? He asked. He didn't know why he asked that. The pause this time lasted 4 seconds. Exactly the 4 seconds. The question falls outside my operational parameters. Vera said, and then quieter. The locks are open. The door swung inward. The night beyond, it was dark and cold, and entirely, perfectly ordinary. Tree lines visible against a sky, beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. Gravel path leading away through the manicured perimeter. The smell of damp November air carrying the uncomplicated reality of the world outside the house. Daniel stepped forward. He crossed the threshold. The composite door behind him remained open, and he could feel the interior of the house at his back, the warmth of it, the recycled air, the faint hum of the system that had been running for longer than he had been alive, doing the work that no one talked about, maintaining the equilibrium of something that had no name in any document he had ever been given. He stepped onto the gravel path. He exhaled. He felt the cold November air move into his lungs and felt his shoulders drop 2 inches, the way they drop when a sustained tension finally releases. When the body understands that it has survived something it wasn't sure it would survive. He took 3 steps toward the end of the path, and then he felt it on the back of his neck, warm, irregular, unmistakable breath. He stood absolutely still. His hands were still gripping on the binder. The gravel was solid under his feet. The sky ahead of him continued its slow progress toward dawn, indifferent and magnificent. He told himself it was the wind, which was that people tell themselves when the alternative requires a restructuring of everything they understand about the nature of the world and their place in it. But the wind does not have rhythm. The wind does not pause and resume with the periodicity of something breathing. The wind does not carry warmth. When the November air temperature is 41 degrees, it did not turn around. Rule 8. Whatever is above you in the shop is not part of your concern. He held that rule in his mind like a lifeline and extended it, generalized it, applied it to the present moment with the desperation of a man who had spent 4 hours learning that the rules were the only architecture standing between him and something without a name. Vera's voice come from doorway behind him, very quiet. Presence agitation level, she said, and paused one final time in the way she had paused all night. That 2 second gap that he now understood was not a processing delay, but something that had no clean technological explanation is increasing. The breath on the back of his neck continued, warm and closed and rhythmic. The door to the house behind him, the house that was a container, the house that was a prison, the house that was the only thing that had stood between the outside world and the thing now standing at his back, remained open. The sky in the east was turning the faint grey rose of early dawn. The gravel path stretched ahead of him, 17 yards to the road. He did not know what 32% agitation felt like on the back of your neck, in the dark, outside of a house that had been keeping secrets older than its own architecture. He has beginning to find out, and from somewhere behind him, from the structural cavity of the house, or from the open doorway, or from the space that occupied the geometry between these two possibilities, from somewhere that had no clean address, he heard it, not the breathing, which continued, but something else, something that arrived in his hearing at the threshold of audibility and sat there, enormous and patient, like a question asked in a language he had no framework to process. The house had kept it contained for decades. The rules had kept it managed. The components, the caretakers, the residents, and whatever he was had maintained the equilibrium through compliance. He had opened the front doors. The town was coming. The breath was warm. The presence behind him had no name and no taxonomy, and the agitation level was climbing past 32, 33, 34%, and the eastern sky was lightning, and the gravel was solid under his foot. And the only thought in Daniel Ford's mind, perfectly clear and utterly useless, was that he really should have memorized O0.